Lawyers threatening to quit their law firms if their law firms represent President Trump in his effort to get recounts and recount votes and turn around the election. That's not the American way. Will we see the Democrats now control not only the presidency, but also the House and the Senate? And if they do control the Senate, what will that do to our relationship with America's strongest and most reliable ally, Israel? You're going to hear my answers to those hard questions on The Dershow Show. The election may be over, but the fighting is just beginning, and we are such a divided country, and it is showing every single day. Just opening up the newspapers this morning was so disheartening. Law firms, lawyers who are supposed to defend clients are being criticized for defending President Trump and trying to get recounts or challenging the votes. Look, I may not necessarily be on that side, and some of these lawsuits don't look like they're going anywhere, but the idea of condemning a law firm because it brought a lawsuit on behalf of the president. Look, I remember that well. When I defended the president on the floor of the Senate, I lost friends and people attacked me and attacked my integrity and attacked my reputation and credibility. I understand that. But in this election, you'd think, it's part of the American electoral system to call for recounts. It's part of the system to have legal challenges. And the idea that if a law firm, and there are some big law firms, Jones and Day in Cleveland, national law firm, Wright Morris, another national law firm in Ohio, lawyers are threatening to quit the firm unless the firm stops representing President Trump. It's just wrong. We didn't see it in 2000. We saw lawyers on both sides of Bush versus Gore, some good, some not so good lawyers, mostly not so good, on the part of the Democrats, particularly in the United States Supreme Court. But nobody criticized them. Nobody condemned them. Today, everything is pick a side. And if you're on the wrong side, you're going to be condemned. If you're a Republican lawyer and you really believe that there is a basis for bringing a lawsuit, your Democratic colleagues are going to condemn you. And if the shoe were on the other foot, if the election had been won by President Trump and there were protests and challenges by the Democrats, you'd hear the same thing from Republican lawyers. It's just so reminiscent of McCarthyism. I grew up during McCarthyism. I remember it so well. Lawyers were condemned, were attacked for defending the wrong people. It's so inconsistent with our Constitution and with the role of lawyers, and I hope it will stop. I don't think these lawsuits in the end will result in a change in the outcome of the election, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be brought. That doesn't mean that lawyers shouldn't be giving their best advice to clients. But what I think lawyers ought to tell their client, particularly if their client is the President of the United States, is that we're bringing these lawsuits, but if we lose, we expect you to comply with the law. We expect you to abide by the decision. That's the implicit agreement that you make with courts when you bring lawsuits, that you will comply in the end if you lose or if you win. In that respect, it's like elections. When you run for office, basically you're making a deal with the American public. You're saying, vote for me. I hope I will win. But if I lose, and if I lose legitimately, I will gracefully, even if it's not in my heart, concede defeat and congratulate and help the opponent in the transition. That's what's supposed to happen. Now, what happens if you really feel that the election has been stolen? Richard Nixon thought his election was stolen from him in 1960. Al Gore thought the same in 2000. But nonetheless, they put the interests of continuity and the interests of respecting judicial outcomes and election outcomes ahead of their own personal interests. And they did reluctantly concede defeat. I think that's going to happen here as well, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen this week or next week. It's going to take some time. There will be some quick results, Pennsylvania perhaps, and there'll be much slower results in other states, Nevada and Arizona and Georgia. Speaking of Georgia, there are two elections coming up on January 5th. You thought we were through with elections. No, 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 no. You thought it was safe to get back in the water. No, no, no. Hey, I'm on Martha's Vineyard where the safe to get back in the water took place during Jaws. It's not safe to stop listening to my podcast. It's not safe to eliminate your mind's view of politics. On January 5th, we're going to have two elections in the same place in Georgia for two Senate seats. And those two Senate seats probably will determine who controls the Senate. If the Republican incumbents win, then they will have a two-seat majority in the Senate and will control the Senate. If the two Democratic challengers win, then it will be a 50-50 split. And guess what happens if there's a 50-50 split? Ties are broken by the Vice President of the United States, and that's Kamala Harris, and she will obviously break the tie in favor of the Democrats. So the Democrats will control the Senate, the House, and the presidency if the two Georgia Democrats win the election. So, hey, I'm a liberal Democrat. I would normally be happy with both Democrats winning, but I'm not. One of the Democrats running for the seat that was filled recently when the previous senator retired, and Kelly Loeffler was appointed to replace her, but she has to now run for re-election after having served for a couple of years, and she's running against a prominent black minister, the Reverend Warnock, who was the minister in Martin Luther King's church. He seems to have a lot of support, and he seems like a nice guy, and he got a lot of votes in the election. But there's a problem. I am not only a liberal Democrat, I'm also a strong supporter of Israel and America's relationship with Israel. I think Israel is America's strongest and most reliable ally, certainly in the Middle East. We're involved now in an ongoing peace process with Israel and the Gulf states. It looks very, very promising. So why am I concerned about the Reverend Warnock? Because last year he signed an outrageous, bigoted, despicable letter that was rampantly anti-Israel. The letter itself talked one-sidedly about Israel building walls, which were reminiscent of the Berlin Wall, without ever mentioning that the reason that Israel had to build these security barriers, 95% of them not being walls, but just being electronic fences, was to keep out terrorists. And thousands of lives, both Israeli and Palestinian lives, were saved by these barriers. They're inconvenient, to be sure. I've had to go through them. I've had to wait my turn to go through these barriers when I wanted to visit various cities on the West Bank. But they save lives. But you read this outrageous letter signed by potentially future United States Senator, the Reverend Warnock. The word terrorism isn't mentioned. You get a sense that Israel built these walls just because they like what walls look like, or they built walls for the same reason that the East Berliners built a wall to prevent people from coming over and becoming West Berliners. Not a word about terrorism. In fact, quite the opposite. The letter commends the Palestinians for giving up violence, never mentioning the pay-to-slay policy that the Palestinian Authority has, whereby they pay money to the families of terrorists. When a terrorist comes into a house of a Jewish person and murders their 11-year-old child and their 6-year-old child and the mother and the grandmother, and say he's killed or captured the terrorist, the Palestinian Authority pays the family, gives them a reward. That's why Congress passed a statute saying the Palestinians could no longer get funds from the United States as long as they have this pay-to-slay policy. Not a word about it in this letter. Not a mention of terrorism. Israel is just an oppressive country. It detains, it tortures, it kills Palestinians just because it doesn't like them. Not a word about terrorism. And then the letter gets to Gaza and says Gaza is an open-air prison. There are restrictions on movement in Gaza. Not a word about the thousands of rockets that have been sent from the Gaza Strip to kill Israeli civilians, again, men, women, and children. Not a word about the terror tunnels. I wrote a book called Terror Tunnels, about these tunnels dug between Gaza and Israeli kibbutzim and schools in an effort to murder as many Israeli children as possible. And let's remember, there's a history of that. Palestinian terrorists murdered, I think it was 32 Israeli children at a school in a city called Ma'alot, not so long ago, certainly within my memory. Not a word about it. And then the letter goes on to condemn Israel for not being willing to negotiate with the Palestinians. Not a word about the fact they offered them a state in 2000, 2001. They offered to end the occupation in 2007, 2008. They have now offered to sit down and negotiate. The Palestinians, who don't know how to take yes for an answer and never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, refused the Israeli offers, and now they refuse even to sit down and negotiate. Not a word about that in this letter. The letter is a completely one-sided attack on Israel. It also calls for sympathetic views of economic sanctions against Israel, which means the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanctions, singling out only Israel and attacking Israel. The letter says that's the only way of bringing Israel to the negotiating table. What nonsense. Israel wants to come to the negotiating table. Prime Minister Netanyahu has made a standing offer. I'll come anywhere. I'll go anywhere. I'll negotiate anywhere. Come, Palestinians, sit and negotiate. And the Palestinian leadership has said, absolutely no. I know that because I sat with Abbas, and I sat with a man who died just yesterday or today, Saeb Erekat, who was the second in command of the Palestinian Authority. I sat with them in Washington, D.C., and we talked about trying to start negotiations, and they refused. So the letter is just filled with lies. Shame on reverends and ministers and clergymen for lying so much about the nation state of the Jewish people. Do they lie about other countries, or do they single out only Israel for this kind of condemnation? Now you wouldn't know what this letter contained if you read biased newspapers like the Jewish Daily Forward, which said, oh yeah, there was this letter, but it's not so bad. In fact, there's no reason to believe that the Reverend Warnock is not a, quote, strong supporter of Israel. Strong supporter of Israel with this one-sided condemnation. So I'm in a quandary, and I really want your help on this, folks. I'm in a quandary. I'm a liberal Democrat. I want to see the Democrats take control of the Senate, but I cannot and will not support an anti-Israel bigot. And unless the Reverend Warnock rescinds his signature in that letter, and unless he can persuade me, and I hope persuade others, that his views were mistaken and that he doesn't support BDS against Israel. Yes, he claims to support the two-state solution, but his two-state solution requires the return of refugees, which would turn Israel into yet another Muslim state. So even his support for the two-state solution is not support for the kind of two-state solution that is ever realistic or on the table. So I want to hear from you, particularly if any of you live in Georgia, but anywhere, because the Reverend is asking for financial support. And I would normally send contributions to a Democrat who was running to try to take over the Senate. I'm not sending him a nickel. I'm not sending him one penny unless I hear that he's changed his views. I want to hear from you. What do you think? You know, I never thought I would see a conflict between my being a Democrat, my being a liberal, and my being a supporter of Israel. But with the hard left in the Democratic Party, and I think you have to include this Reverend among the AOC squad hard left anti-Israel group, we're seeing that conflict. It's also playing out now. New York Times today had a story about how people on the hard left are trying to take over the Biden administration. they're trying to get control of his foreign policy. They quote Professor Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, who's virulently anti-Israel. He wrote a scandalous book called The Israel Lobby, which was really a condemnation of all American Jews and others who support Israel for trying to maintain American support for Israel. They quote Mearsheimer as basically saying, well, it's time for us, people like us, people on the left, people who don't support Israel, to take over the foreign policy of the United States. And so it will be interesting to see who President-elect Biden appoints to positions of authority: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, Ambassador to Israel, Ambassador to other countries in the Middle East. We're seeing this played out now in a lot of forums. We're seeing it played out in Georgia, and we're going to see it played out, more importantly, in Washington. So I feel conflicted today as a Democrat, as a liberal, and as a strong supporter of Israel. Help me out. Tell me what you think I should do. Please call in and give me your advice as to how I and others, and there are tens of thousands of others who are in my boat, who would like to be Democrats, who would like to support the Democratic control of the Senate, but who cannot, in good conscience, support a candidate who is so one-sidedly opposed to Israel and so one-sidedly in favor of what appears to be terrorism, because he never condemns terrorism. He never even acknowledges terrorism. He never discusses rockets and terror tunnels. What's the reason for that? What's the excuse for that? How can anybody support a candidate who takes those views? That's my question for today, and I'm really stymied, and I really want your advice on these issues. So the election may be over, but the battle continue, and you will always hear from me an analysis of what is going on and what the stakes are and what should happen, and if the shoe were on the other foot, how people would react. I know I'll get a lot of pushback from my Democratic friends and colleagues saying it's more important to control the Senate than to have a senator who doesn't support Israel. That's not my view, and I want to know what your view is. So please continue your calls. I love the calls. Again, it's the Dersh Show. All that's missing to complete my name is the wits, Dersh Show wits, and the wits are provided by my callers. So let's turn now to callers and hear your views on the Dersh Show. Our first call today is from Mike in New Jersey.
I heard you speak the other day on TV and realized that this is probably a long shot for the president. But my question is that there's so much allegation all over the country. It seems to be a lot of little things instead of one big thing, but things that there's so much, does that change the chances? I mean, I would imagine that this is the first time something like this has gone on, and it's obviously in a very polarized, state that we're all in right now. So my question to you is I know that you have experience in all these, but does it change because of the circumstances that we're in now? Thank you.
It's a great question. The biggest problem President Trump has is that his complaints take the form of lots and lots of small things in lots and lots of different states. And most of his complaints are only subject to being resolved in the state courts, not in the federal courts, and probably not in the Supreme Court, because they're issues of state law, although the Supreme Court has indicated it would intrude, as they did in Bush versus Gore, in extreme cases. So we're going to see a lot of lawsuits, a flurry of lawsuits. The one that has the best chance of success is in Pennsylvania, but because that doesn't require a trial, the facts are clear. The other ones involve allegations of fraud or miscounted votes, and those require evidence to be taken. And so far, it's been very difficult to gather that evidence in a form that makes it into a winning lawsuit. So I don't think that we're going to see a reversal of President Trump's fortunes. Our next call is from Sharona in California.
Hi, I was just wondering if we should have had a presidential election during a pandemic, or if there's any way constitutionally to postpone it, because it just seems like so much of the confusion is centered around the mail-in ballots and not being ready for the the change in the protocols. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's a great question, and obviously it would be so much better for everybody if we didn't have the pandemic and we could all go to the polls. This is the first time in my life since 1960 I didn't vote in person in the polls. I voted by mail, but we've been through this before. We actually had an election in 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War, and troops had to be sent home to vote, and many people didn't vote. But we had an election. Lincoln won re-election. This is a terrible setting in which to vote, but the Constitution doesn't permit for postponement. It has a date specified for when the term of the president ends, January 20th at noon in the year following the election. So it's locked into the Constitution. Hey, my favorite place in the world, Brooklyn. What do you got to say, Brooklyn?
I just listened to your show. At the end, I was a little disappointed when you said Biden got more votes than any candidate ever got before, and Trump got almost the second most votes that anybody ever got. Now, if we're saying that there was a lot of fraud and there were fake, false, phony votes, then how could you even say the comment that Biden got the most votes anybody ever got? It just doesn't make sense. And we know that it's very interestingly odd that Biden would get so many more votes than, let's say, any person that ran before him, like Obama or Hillary or Trump or anybody. So I just found it odd, and I'd like to understand.
Well, it's a good question. The reason that Biden got more votes than any other previous president is because more people voted than in any prior election, which is really quite surprising in light of the pandemic. But I think that one thing President Trump does is bring out voters for him and against him. He definitely brings out voters. So, it's a little bit misleading when President-elect Biden brags that he got the most votes of anybody, because he got the most votes largely because more people voted than in any prior election. Obviously, everybody got more votes than George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, because very few people voted in those elections. But many more people voted in this election than in the 2016, the 2012, and 2008 election. So not only did President Trump get the second most votes of anybody, even though he lost by, it looks like, close to 5 million votes, but President-elect Biden will end up getting more votes than anybody else. Probably in our next election, whoever wins will get the most votes. It will continue to grow as more and more people vote, as our population increases. We're a much larger country now, population-wise, than we were 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so the people who won these elections will get more votes than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was an extraordinarily popular president, but not that many people voted. So a large part of it is a function of the demographics. But my statement is accurate, because even if you discount all the challenged votes, you're still going to get more votes for Biden and for Trump than in any previous election. Our next call is from Gail in California.
Love to know what you think. I think it's pretty obvious that this was a setup way before this year. If you watched how the Democrats acted, it was pretty blatant that they played a role for Joe to be a fumbling, old, kind of sickly kind of man. A lot of us saw right through that, especially during the debate. So I think, no, I believe, absolutely there's corruption. The proof, I don't know if they're getting it, because if it was me, I'd have everybody I know in town working every single state and have people standing there watching everything, whether they liked it or not. And obviously that didn't happen, but this was a pretty big setup. And I think there were a lot of things being said during the year that no one in the Republican Party really picked up on as to how the Democrats were manipulating. I believe they were getting back because of the Clintons, and I believe that's why this all came about, but I also think China's very much involved. So love to hear your response and what you think, and love that you left a phone number for people to call and talk to you. I think that's really important. So I wish you well, and thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for your calls. I do agree that every counting mechanism should be recorded. I don't see any reason why all the counting shouldn't be recorded on videotape and archived, and then if there's a challenge, you go back. That's actually better than having people standing over you and watching the count, because people could misread and misunderstand. That could be disruptive. But if you had video cameras in every counting station and the videos were archived and kept under seal, because you don't want them to be made public necessarily unless there's a challenge. But if there's a challenge, you then go and look at it. I do not think China or Russia or Iran had any impact on this election. Certainly, there was less of that this time than last time. I think part of the reason is we were aware of the fact that Russia was trying to influence not necessarily the outcome of the election, maybe not. I'm not sure of that. But certainly they wanted to sow disarray and discontent. And I do think that Iran, if it had its way, would like to influence the outcome of this election. Obviously, Iran would much prefer to have Biden as president than Trump as president, solely because of the Iran deal. President Trump got us out of the deal, and President-elect Biden has suggested that he would get us back in the deal, I hope with modifications and changes. Otherwise, I will have to oppose it as well. But we had an election, and there are challenges, and in the end, the challenges will be considered, and the person with the most votes will be the president, most electoral votes, and I predict that will be Joe Biden, and he will be inaugurated on January 20th, and I hope that the nation, in the end, accepts that, whether you approve of it or not, or like it or not. It's the American way. I think the other side should also have accepted, if the president had won, we'd see protests and objections on both sides. But the American way, in the end, is to challenge, recount, do all of that, have law firms get involved, but then in the end accept what the resolution is. Our next call is in what has become one of the most important states in America, Georgia.
Hi, Mr. Dershowitz. I'm calling to get your opinion on faithless electors in this election. Obviously, you can't tell who's going to vote which way, but I wanted to get your opinion on the federal legality of it and statewide legality of it, and whether or not you think we're going to see more of that this election cycle.
Well, first of all, the very concept of faithless electors is not something that the framers could have imagined. They didn't think electors were either going to be faithful or faithless. They would vote their conscience, and they did that in the election of 1880, I think it was. 1820, when Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams, and there have been electors throughout history who have not voted consistent with what the votes were in their states. But now we expect that the electoral votes will go according to the vote, and so we have introduced the concept of faithless electors. I think we had 2 of them in the last election. We may have some in this election, but not enough to determine or change the outcome of the vote. Our next call is from California. Malcolm?
So I got a question for you. There's big talk in the news came out yesterday about the vaccine coming out for the novel coronavirus.
Yeah. And
my question is, what can be, from a legal standpoint, the requirements of taking such a vaccine? Is there legal precedent to mandate that citizens take a vaccine? How would this affect us? That's my question for you, Professor Dershowitz. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. It's a great question. There is one Supreme Court precedent. It's called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It involved the smallpox vaccine, and it involved only a fine for not vaccinating your child who was going to school. But the Supreme Court, in the decision, talked about mandatory vaccinations as being constitutionally permissible if and only if it's to prevent the spread of a communicable disease. For example, if somebody were to invent a vaccine to prevent heart attacks or strokes or cancer, they couldn't compel me to take that. That's my own life. I have the right to decide whether I want to take medicine that will save my own life if I'm an adult and I'm competent. On the other hand, I can't be a typhoid Mary. I don't have the right to spread a disease to other people. So if there's an effective and safe and proven vaccine that can prevent the spread of the disease, the courts will sustain that as constitutional, with perhaps some exceptions. If you can prove medical necessity, if you can prove maybe religious objection, I'm not sure that would hold if this was a rule of general application. But I think we're going to see these issues litigated because we're going to get a vaccine and there are going to be protesters. The anti-vaxxers will be out there in full force, and you'll have other people who are not anti-vaxxers but just are concerned about this vaccine. Has it been tested enough? Has it been tested on old people enough? Do you have confidence in it? These will be issues that will be raised, but I think most people, if the vaccine is proved safe and efficient, most people will want to benefit from it. Our next call is from another state that was bitterly contested, Arizona. Scott.
Could you help explain what concession means? I don't think the word is in the Constitution, and so I don't know why it's become an expectation. Is it in state law? How all that works? I'd really like to get your point of view.
It's a great question. You're absolutely right. The word concession does not appear in the Constitution. I'm sure it may appear in some state law involving recounts, but not predominant. No, concession is just something that's become traditional, but it doesn't have to happen. If on January 20th, President Trump has not conceded the election, he will simply have to reluctantly and over objection move out of the White House and make room for the president-elect, if the president-elect is elected by the Electoral College in December. It's only at that point, by the way, that the president-elect becomes the president-elect. CNN has no authority to name somebody president-elect, nor does Fox, nor does MSNBC. That's just a convention that we use, calling him president-elect, and world leaders have recognized him as the result of CNN and Fox calling the election. But he doesn't become the official president-elect until the electors cast their votes for him, and it's certified by Congress that those votes have been cast, and then he officially becomes president-elect, and certain rules begin to apply. Concession is a political act, and if a presidential candidate concedes, then certain things do happen. Transition processes begin to move in effect. Right now, we're seeing a situation where we're seeing some delays in some of the transition issues because there's been no concession. There's no legal obligation to concede. You're absolutely right. And it's a fair point because most people in the public think that once the election has been called by the networks, then there's been a change in law. That's just not the reality. So thank you all very much for your terrific, terrific questions. You're going to hear more good questions. And when I ask you for your advice, as I did on this show, for what to do and how I should think about a complicated issue, I really mean it. So I hope you'll call me and tell me what you think about the Georgia situation, about other situations we've discussed. I really look forward to hearing your views. I learn from them all the time on the Der Show. So our deal is this. I learn from you, and I promise you, you'll never be bored. So stay tuned. Come back and listen to the Der Show. An important part of the Der Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on the Der Show.